August 1944. The Pacific sun burns white against the sea as a landing craft grinds against coral. Inside, a dozen Japanese soldiers sit motionless, thin, silent, eyes fixed on the deck. Their uniforms are in tatters, their skin burned and peeling. They had fought on Saipan until their ammunition ran dry. Capture, they were told, was worse than death. The enemy would mutilate them, starve them, laugh as they died. The ramp lowers. Boots splash into the water, not Japanese, but American. The men are young tanned, relaxed in the casual confidence of those who know the war is turning their way. A medic steps forward, his canteen extended. The prisoners flinch. One trembles as he takes the canteen, sipping cautiously. It's cold. Clean. Then a tin tray, a slice of white bread, something pink and oily they've never seen before, Spam. The Americans call it breakfast. For the first time, the captured soldiers taste a world that should not exist in war. Abundance, mercy, and a strange, disarming kindness. But this moment didn't happen by chance. It was born from years of fear, propaganda, and two civilizations colliding in total war. Before that canteen of water touched the lips of a captured soldier, the idea of surrender itself had already been condemned in Japan. From the earliest days of the empire's rise, the warrior's path, Bushido, preached that death was the only honorable escape from defeat. A soldier captured alive was no longer a soldier, he was a ghost, stripped of name, loyalty, and soul. By 1941, this belief had hardened into military doctrine. Officers drilled it into recruits from the first day of training. Textbooks, films, and propaganda leaflets declared that Allied forces tortured prisoners, desecrated their bodies, and used them for target practice. To die shouting, "Tenno Haika Banzai," "Long live the Emperor," was considered the highest virtue a man could achieve. So when Japanese forces swept across the Pacific, from the Philippines to Burma, few expected to survive defeat. On island after island, soldiers fought until ammunition and hope ran dry. At Saipan, entire units committed mass suicide. At Tarawa, fewer than 20 Japanese soldiers were taken alive from nearly 5,000. American troops, seeing this level of fanaticism, believed no Japanese man would ever surrender willingly. The early battles taught both sides a terrible rhythm. One side fought to the last, the other killed to the last. But somewhere between the jungle of Guadalcanal and the beaches of Saipan, that rhythm began to change. A handful of Japanese soldiers, wounded, delirious, starving, were captured alive. They expected execution. Instead, they were bandaged, given water, and carried to field hospitals. Word of these encounters spread through the ranks of U.S. Marines and Navy corpsmen. They're human after all, one corporal wrote home in 1943. They just don't know what mercy looks like. Inside Japan, however, the story was inverted. Military censors claimed those who fell into enemy hands were missing in action or killed in duty. Their families were told to mourn. Mothers received empty boxes draped in flags. To admit a son was captured was to dishonor generations. This psychological wall defined the Pacific War. For American commanders, prisoners were a rare intelligence asset, living maps who could reveal enemy codes, supply routes, and morale. But for the prisoners themselves, captivity was a spiritual collapse. Every step they took toward an Allied camp was a step away from the world they had been trained to die for. By 1944, as Japan's empire began to shrink, U.S. military planners faced a paradox. They wanted intelligence from captured soldiers, yet those soldiers refused to be captured at all. Pamphlets, loudspeakers, and leaflets dropped from the air urged surrender. You will be treated kindly. You will be fed. You will live. Few believed it. Then came the photographs. Japanese POWs eating, smiling, even helping at camps in Hawaii and Australia. These images, carefully managed by Allied psychological warfare units, were designed to challenge the myth of barbaric enemies. They showed clean uniforms, full plates of food, and humane guards. Behind every picture, though, lay a deeper mission: to fracture the belief that Americans were monsters and to remind ordinary Japanese soldiers that life could continue beyond defeat. The first captured men were interrogated gently, with interpreters, cigarettes, and coffee instead of fists. Their astonishment was often recorded. Some burst into tears. Others refused to eat, convinced the food was poisoned. Many begged to be executed rather than live in shame. Yet slowly, through repeated exposure to routine kindness, disbelief softened into quiet acceptance. These early experiences created ripples that reached far beyond the camps. U.S. intelligence officers realized that kindness itself could be a form of psychological warfare. A well-fed prisoner could reveal more through comfort than through fear. By mid-1944, America's POW policy had become one of the most organized in modern warfare, a combination of discipline, moral purpose, and subtle propaganda. Every camp was to be a stage where the enemy could witness firsthand the strength of democratic abundance. But before those camps could function as symbols, the war itself had to carve the paths that led men into captivity. And those paths, brutal, starving, scorched by the Pacific sun, were forged in the crucible of total war. By the summer of 1944, the United States held thousands of Axis prisoners across the world: Germans in Texas, Italians in Georgia, and now, slowly, Japanese captured from the Pacific. But unlike the prisoners from Europe, these men arrived from a universe shaped by starvation and fanaticism. For them, even the sight of a full meal was a contradiction. The foundation of America's prisoner system was the 1929 Geneva Convention, which required humane treatment, shelter, food, medical care, and correspondence with family through the Red Cross. It was not a suggestion, it was law. U.S. military police and the Army's Provost Marshal General enforced it rigorously, knowing every violation could be mirrored by the enemy against captured Americans. Prisoners were processed like soldiers rather than criminals. Each was registered, deloused, and assigned to a camp according to rank and location. They received uniforms marked PW, medical screenings, and even dental care, luxuries unimaginable on the front lines. 3 meals a day were guaranteed. In the Pacific camps, the menu often reflected the U.S. Army ration scale: eggs, rice, vegetables, sometimes meat or Spam. Even coffee, that quintessential American comfort, was served regularly. For Japanese soldiers raised on tales of American cruelty, The first morning roll call was a quiet revelation. They stood in line, waiting for punishment. Instead, they received soap, blankets, and bread. When asked their names, many hesitated, believing it a trick. The guards did not strike them. Instead, they instructed them to rest, to eat, to recover their strength. Word of this treatment reached higher commands. Some U.S. officers worried it was too generous. But General George C. Marshall and the War Department insisted discipline, not revenge, defined the U.S. military. Every act of fairness was not weakness, it was strategy. We will win this war not only by power, one directive stated, but by the example of civilization itself. Meanwhile, Japanese-run POW camps across Asia told the opposite story. The Burma-Thailand Railway, the Bataan Death March, the mines of Manchuria, all had become symbols of suffering. Over 30% of Allied prisoners in Japanese custody died from starvation, disease, or execution. Captured Americans, Australians, and British troops endured beatings, forced labor, and near total deprivation. To the Japanese command, this brutality was not mere hatred. It was ideology. In their view, surrender was betrayal, so those who surrendered deserved no mercy. The emperor's armies believed they were fighting not against individual soldiers, but against a Western world that threatened their divine mission. Compassion, therefore, was seen as moral weakness. The contrast could not have been sharper. In one corner of the world, American guards handed out rations packed by industrial kitchens back home. In another, Allied prisoners dug graves for their own comrades along jungle trails. These parallel realities would define post-war memory and the moral reckoning that followed. Within the American camps, psychologists and intelligence officers observed the effects of humane treatment closely. Many POs showed visible confusion. Some wrote in their diaries, later recovered after the war, that they could not reconcile what they saw with what they had been taught. One wrote, "We were told Americans eat our flesh. Instead, they feed us theirs." Another recorded that the guards smiled without mockery. It is unbearable. Gradually, daily life became routine. Prisoners were given work assignments, farm labor, maintenance, translation, and even assisting in constructing additional camp facilities. Those with English skills helped interrogators or taught fellow POs basic English phrases. The structure of camp life, order, cleanliness, discipline, gave them a sense of stability that had long been lost in the chaos of war. By late 1944, Red Cross delegates were regularly inspecting camps in Hawaii, Australia, and the continental United States. Reports confirmed consistent compliance with the Geneva Rules. Photographs showed Japanese POWs working in fields, playing baseball, even posing for group portraits. These images became powerful tools for Allied propaganda, dropped over enemy positions with captions like, "Your comrades live. You can too." For the Japanese soldiers still in the field, these images seemed impossible. Propaganda meant to break morale, but for those behind barbed wire, the truth was undeniable. They were alive. They were treated as men. The American camp system became more than a holding area. It was a mirror reflecting two civilizations' understanding of war. One saw mercy as a weapon, the other as weakness. As the war intensified through the Marianas, Leyte, and Iwo Jima, more prisoners would arrive, carrying the last illusions of imperial glory with them. Each one would be confronted not by cruelty, but by abundance, by the steady, mechanical kindness of a nation that could feed even its enemies. And within that abundance lay the quiet beginning of something larger, a moral weapon more powerful than any bomb or bullet, the idea that mercy itself could reshape the enemy's mind. For most Japanese soldiers, captivity began in silence. They did not speak, did not look up, and rarely accepted food on the first day. Their faces were hollow, their uniforms little more than rags soaked in salt and blood. The smell of jungle sweat and gunpowder clung to them. They expected humiliation, maybe execution, yet what came instead was routine. Guards handed out food trays without expression. Some prisoners wept quietly as they received rice for the first time in weeks. Others refused to eat, believing poison was hidden inside the warm stew. A few, trembling with shame, tried to take their own lives with stolen cutlery, stopped only by startled medics. American doctors and chaplains recorded everything. They noticed that many prisoners were not simply malnourished. They were disoriented, their identities fractured. In the Japanese army, a captured man ceased to exist. Here, he was being fed and called by name again. It was a kind of resurrection, but one that hurt. One camp interpreter recalled a soldier whispering through tears, "Why do you feed the enemy?" The American guard shrugged. "Because you're human, that's all." That sentence, simple, almost careless, shattered years of propaganda. For the first time, these men realized the Americans were not demons or animals. They were orderly, efficient, sometimes even kind. The sound of music from radios, the smell of soap, the regular clang of mealtime bells, all reminders that the enemy's world was built not on fanaticism, but on systems, machines, and comfort. Some POs, once recovered, began to write journals or small letters, supervised, translated, and archived. In those pages, the human transformation is visible, horror giving way to wonder, hatred softening into disbelief. One prisoner wrote in 1945 from a camp in Hawaii, "I believed capture would mean death. Instead, I lived like a guest of my enemy. My country told me lies. Now I do not know who I am." To the Americans guarding them, this confusion was victory. To the prisoners, it was rebirth, painful but real. The kindness the POWs experienced was not entirely spontaneous. Behind it lay deliberate psychological design, a quiet weapon shaped in Washington, Pearl Harbor, and Honolulu. U.S. Army intelligence officers had realized early that torture produced little useful intelligence. Fanatical soldiers either lied or died. But food routine and dignity had a different effect. A prisoner who felt safe was more likely to talk, not because he was coerced, but because his world had been gently dismantled. This approach was formalized in what came to be known as strategic humanity. Every act of fairness, a clean barracks, a good meal, a cigarette, was part of a larger goal to erode the ideological armor forged by Japanese indoctrination. Psychological warfare experts such as L.T. Call, Sidney Mashbear, and linguist John Emerson developed interrogation methods based on rapport, not brutality. Their philosophy was simple. A man at ease reveals more than a man in fear. And every revelation, a battalion location, a command code, a morale report, could save lives on the battlefield. POW camps were designed as miniature theaters of American modernity. They showed industrial power, logistical precision, and moral self-control. The message was subtle but devastating. This is what civilization looks like. You were told we were barbarians. Now look around. Propaganda units took advantage of this contrast. Leaflets dropped over Japanese positions showed images of POWs smiling or working in gardens with captions like, "They live. You can live too." For Japanese soldiers starving in bunkers or caves, the promise of food and survival clashed violently with their code of honor. But as desperation grew, the human instinct to live began to outweigh the command to die. Inside the camps, psychologists recorded another change, one they hadn't entirely predicted. Some prisoners began to take pride in their new orderliness, treating the camp like a disciplined military unit. They cleaned barracks, organized study groups, even formed small orchestras. The enemy, once faceless, had become routine, and routine created trust. American guards noticed that once kindness became expected, information flowed naturally. Prisoners volunteered details about their units, the morale of the Imperial Army, and even opinions about Emperor Hirohito. Not all of it was reliable, but it showed that fear had been replaced by dialogue, the first crack in the wall of imperial conditioning. Yet this use of kindness had an unintended moral consequence. Many guards began to feel sympathy for the men they were meant to interrogate. They saw in them not monsters, but boys. Some barely 18, drafted, brainwashed, and sent to die for slogans they didn't understand. Letters from American guards often expressed guilt. "They remind me of my brother." One sergeant wrote home, "Only he's on the other side." In this strange intersection of mercy and manipulation, the line between compassion and strategy blurred. The U.S. military had discovered that humanity itself could be a form of control, and the prisoners, for all their gratitude, slowly realized they were part of something larger than mere survival. For every bite of white bread, every cup of coffee, there was a quiet question hanging in the air. If the enemy can be kind, then what was all this war for? That question would haunt the returning prisoners long after the guns fell silent. But before that reckoning could come, the war itself would reveal even deeper contrasts, not only in emotion and ideology, but in industry, technology, and culture. And that is where the next angles begin, the machinery that made American abundance possible, and the moral paradox that turned kindness into propaganda. Behind every meal that reached a Japanese prisoner's hands stood a chain of machines, workers, and supply ships stretching from the U.S. mainland to the far edge of the Pacific. The same industrial miracle that built aircraft carriers and B-29 bombers also built food, packaged, processed, and shipped in staggering quantities. In the American system of war, food was strategy. Canned meats, powdered eggs, dehydrated potatoes, chocolate bars, cigarettes, coffee, all flowed through an immense logistical network to feed not only millions of soldiers, but also captured enemies required planning at a scale few nations could match. From the factory towns of Illinois to the ports of San Francisco, industrial lines operated 24 hours a day. Every can of Spam, every loaf of white bread symbolized not luxury, but capability. The United States could feed the world, even in wartime. For the Japanese POWs, this abundance was incomprehensible. In their homeland, rice was rationed, and by 1944, civilians were boiling weeds for soup. Soldiers had survived on handfuls of barley and dried fish. To see their captors eat well, and then share that food freely, was to confront an enemy whose power went beyond weapons. Some prisoners wrote later that America's factories were more frightening than its bombs. The machines that forged mercy could also forge annihilation. The same cargo ships that carried Spam and flour also carried tanks, shells, and napalm. America's kindness, they realized, was not born from fragility, but from overwhelming strength. This industrial humanity was itself a message. We can afford to be merciful because we have conquered scarcity. Every steaming meal, every stocked storeroom was proof of a civilization that had mastered logistics. It was an empire of production, one that defeated not only Japan's armies, but its very notion of endurance through suffering. For many Americans, the treatment of Japanese prisoners was more than policy. It was a moral statement. The nation had entered the war with a belief that its fight was not merely against Japan or Germany, but against barbarism itself. To mistreat prisoners would have meant admitting that America had lost the moral war, even if it won the military one. The Geneva Convention, the Christian ethic of mercy, and the cultural pride in fair play fused into a quiet discipline that defined much of the American military's identity. Even among soldiers filled with hatred after Pearl Harbor or Bataan, orders were clear: prisoners were to be fed, protected, and documented. Still, this moral stance existed beside a deep contradiction. Many Japanese civilians and even soldiers were dehumanized in American propaganda. Hollywood films, newspaper cartoons, and wartime posters often portrayed them as rats or insects. Yet when those same enemies were captured, the system demanded they be treated with humanity. It was in its way the greatest test of America's ideals. Could a nation that burned Tokyo to ashes also feed its surviving soldiers with compassion? The answer, contradictory, imperfect, but real, was yes. For the prisoners, this contradiction was impossible to process. They had been told Americans were devils, void of honor. Now those devils handed them food, spoke to them without hatred, and kept them alive with medical care. Many broke down under the moral weight of that realization. Kindness became a mirror, one that forced them to see their own nation differently. If the enemy could show mercy, what did it mean for the Japanese ideology of divine purity and sacrifice? The shock was not just physical, it was philosophical. It questioned the foundation of the imperial myth that Japan's spiritual superiority justified conquest and cruelty. In this quiet reversal, the act of being fed by the enemy became an act of awakening. Mercy was no longer weakness, it was truth made visible. Back in Tokyo, rumors began to circulate. Japanese intelligence intercepted leaflets dropped by the Americans showing POWs in good health. Some were dismissed as enemy trickery, but reports from neutral nations and the Red Cross began to confirm them. Senior officers in the Imperial Army reacted with anger and denial. General Tojo's staff insisted the photographs were staged. Military newspapers told citizens that captured soldiers were used as slaves or experimented upon. But privately, some commanders grew anxious. If the Americans were treating prisoners humanly, then every act of brutality committed by Japan would carry heavier weight in post-war judgment. Within the camps, POWs who expressed gratitude or curiosity about America were often isolated by their peers. To admire the enemy was still considered treasonous, but even silence could not stop what was spreading. Stories whispered during work detail, rumors shared through fences, words passed from man to man. They feed us like they feed their own. After Japan's surrender, these same whispers returned home. Repatriated POWs, stepping back onto Japanese soil, brought with them memories of endless food, clean clothes, and the bewildering decency of the enemy. Their stories conflicted with everything wartime propaganda had claimed. At first, few believed them. Then, as occupation forces arrived and the truth of the empire's defeat became visible, those accounts gained weight. In the years to come, these former POs became unintentional ambassadors, proof that mercy could outlive war. Some would later testify to Allied tribunals about their treatment, shocking Japanese citizens who had been taught that surrender was a fate worse than death. Their words carried quiet power. They did not glorify America, but they dismantled the myth of Japanese infallibility. Through them, a generation began to understand that war had not been a clash between gods and demons, but between men, each capable of cruelty or compassion. Kindness had crossed enemy lines, and soon it would do something even greater, begin to dissolve the psychological wall that divided conqueror from conquered, captor from captive, human from human. But the true breaking point, the moment when kindness became more than mercy, when it altered the very nature of surrender, came at the war's climax, as Japan's armies collapsed and POWs experienced the unthinkable, America's victory through abundance. By the spring of 1945, the tide of the Pacific War had turned completely. Japan's empire, once stretching from the jungles of Burma to the islands of the Central Pacific, was collapsing under the weight of American air power and blockade. Each new battle produced more captives, and with them came a quiet revolution of understanding. On Saipan, in the Philippines, and later on Okinawa, American units found hundreds of Japanese soldiers too wounded or disoriented to die for the emperor. Some were unconscious when captured. Others, trembling with shame, surrendered only after being promised food or medical help. These were not the proud warriors of imperial propaganda. They were emaciated men who had reached the edge of belief itself. At a U.S. detention facility near Honolulu, a group of 30 POs stood in line for breakfast. The air smelled faintly of coffee and machine oil. Trucks roared in the distance, carrying crates of rations, cans stamped, packed in Chicago. The prisoners were issued trays, each holding eggs, fruit toast, and a small tin of meat. A few hesitated, unsure whether to eat in front of their guards. Then one of them, a former corporal from the 24th Infantry Regiment, began to eat. Slowly, methodically, he raised his head and whispered, almost in disbelief, "They eat the same food we do." It was a small moment, but within it, the entire war turned. The enemy, once imagined as monsters, was revealed to be not only human, but generous in victory. Across the Pacific, other camps told similar stories. At Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, Japanese prisoners were astonished to find snow for the first time. They built snowmen and posed for photographs beside American guards. In the Philippines, captured airmen were given paper, pencils, and even books to study English. In Hawaii, a group of engineers repaired vehicles for the U.S. Army, grateful simply to be treated as professionals rather than animals. Each encounter carried the same emotional paradox: shame mixed with relief, fear replaced by confusion. The war had been fought to defend the honor of Japan's empire, yet defeat had brought unexpected dignity. It was a truth no bullet could teach. Only mercy could. The U.S. military's prisoner of war branch, headquartered in Washington, understood this power well. Reports from Pacific camps describe dramatic changes in morale. Within weeks of humane treatment, many prisoners became cooperative, answering questions about troop movements, supply shortages, and even morale among front-line units. Intelligence officers noted that, well, fed prisoners are more talkative than hungry ones. But beyond the intelligence value, something deeper was happening, a quiet reshaping of identity. For years, Japanese soldiers had been told that capture meant annihilation of the self. Yet here, in enemy hands, they were being given names, ranks, and purpose again. The act of kindness had become a psychological weapon more profound than any artillery barrage. One American camp doctor later wrote, "They didn't understand mercy because they'd never been shown it. When we gave them food, they saw our power. When we gave them dignity, they saw our strength." That realization rippled through the POW system. Camp officers noticed that even guards behaved differently when treating prisoners decently. Hatred gave way to curiosity. Some learned fragments of Japanese. Others traded cigarettes or played baseball together. A strange respect began to form, not equality, but something close enough to remind both sides of their shared humanity. Meanwhile, Japanese command structures were collapsing. Radio Tokyo continued to broadcast slogans of eternal victory, but returning POWs, captured early in the war and repatriated through neutral countries like Switzerland, told another story. They spoke of American ships stocked with food, of prisoners treated by nurses, of doctors who performed surgeries to save enemy limbs. The accounts were dismissed as enemy lies, but when more reports surfaced, even die-hard officers began to sense the truth. America had not only defeated Japan militarily, it had morally outclassed it. For the prisoners still in captivity, this truth unfolded in daily rituals: morning roll call, clean uniforms, full meals. The structure of captivity began to resemble a kind of order, almost peaceful compared to the chaos they'd left behind. And in that order, Many began to see not humiliation, but survival. A few even started to hope for Japan's defeat, quietly realizing that only surrender could end the suffering of their families back home. One interpreter, writing years later, recalled a prisoner saying, "If the emperor knew how the Americans treat us, he would end this war tomorrow." By the summer of 1945, as atomic fire consumed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that same logic spread like smoke. Invisible, unstoppable. The myth of Japanese invincibility had burned away. The enemy had won not through cruelty, but through a civilization built on industry, discipline, and a strange compassion that Japan's warriors had never been taught to understand. For those still behind barbed wire, the end of the war came not with fanfare, but with the quiet click of a radio. When news of surrender reached the camps, many prisoners wept, not out of joy or despair, but out of release. The burden of shame had ended. They were no longer soldiers without a country. They were men again. But the story did not end at surrender. For many, the next chapter began only when the gates opened. When America's mercy extended beyond captivity into the rebuilding of Japan itself. When the emperor's voice crackled through the radio on August 15, 1945, few Japanese prisoners could understand the words, but all understood the tone. It was calm, resigned, mortal. For the first time in history, Hirohito spoke directly to his people, surrendering not only the empire, but the entire mythology that had sustained it. Inside a POW camp in Texas, several hundred Japanese soldiers gathered in silence as the interpreter translated the imperial broadcast. The wind rattled the tin roofs. No one moved. Then, a captain, once fierce and unyielding, stood, bowed toward the west, and whispered, "The war is over. We have lost everything except life." That last word, life, carried more weight than anyone in the room could have imagined. In the weeks that followed, American guards watched a transformation unfold. Men who had once refused to eat or speak now began to take part in camp life. They helped in kitchens, joined baseball games, even started sketching portraits of their guards. The hostility that had once separated captor from captive began to dissolve. A camp chaplain wrote, "They expected vengeance, but instead found understanding. They expected starvation, but instead found abundance." That is when we began to win their minds. This psychological turning point, subtle, unrecorded, became a quiet victory of civilization over ideology. In one Midwest camp, prisoners were taken to a nearby American farm as part of a labor program. They harvested corn under the sun, side by side with local workers. During lunch, a farmer's wife brought sandwiches and milk for everyone, including the Japanese. One of the POWs, a young former student from Nagoya, later recalled in his diary, "I had seen America only through the barrel of a gun. Now I saw her in the hands of a woman offering bread. I began to think, perhaps this is why we lost." It wasn't defeat in the military sense that broke the old pride. It was the discovery that the enemy's strength came from something greater than weapons. The industrial harmony of a free society, the dignity of ordinary life, the moral certainty that even enemies deserve decency. American officers often noticed how prisoners reacted to small things: a clean bed, a warm coat, a guard saying, "Good morning." For men raised in a rigid military culture where compassion was seen as weakness, this was a new kind of power, the kind that commanded respect without fear. By late 1945, U.S. authorities began preparing for the repatriation of POWs. Before departure, many prisoners were shown short films about post-war Japan and democracy. Some were skeptical. Others watched in silence as images of voting, rebuilding, and freedom played on screen. The propaganda, gentle by wartime standards, wasn't about humiliation but renewal. It was an introduction to the world that awaited them. In the camp library, a thin volume began to circulate among the prisoners, The American Way of Life, translated by Japanese interpreters. It described democracy, civic responsibility, and the rule of law. It was more than a book. It was an invitation to imagine Japan beyond the ruins. When the first ships carried them home, many Japanese POs carried small tokens from the camps: a photograph, a baseball glove, a folded American flag presented as a farewell gesture. Some even exchanged addresses with their guards, writing letters in the years to come. Decades later, veterans on both sides would recall these moments with a sense of awe. How enemies became teachers, and how defeat became a doorway to understanding. But not all reactions were so serene. Upon returning home, many former POWs found themselves ostracized by their communities. In Imperial Japan, surrender had been considered the ultimate disgrace. To have lived through captivity meant you had failed to die for the emperor. Families avoided speaking of them. Some were denied military pensions. Others were forced into silence, living with the memory of kindness they could not publicly acknowledge. And yet, privately, their hearts had changed. Many later became advocates for peace, education, and reconciliation. Their stories helped shape Japan's post-war identity, quietly reinforcing the idea that strength could come from mercy, not domination. A former Army sergeant who had spent 3 years in an American camp later became a school teacher in Hiroshima. When asked by his students what the Americans were like, he said simply, "They had more food than we could dream of. But what shocked me most was how they shared it." That line, simple, almost mundane, captured the essence of the turning point. America's overwhelming material power, when combined with compassion, achieved what bombs alone could not: the reshaping of a nation's soul. In the months after surrender, as General MacArthur's occupation forces arrived in Japan, some of the same former POWs were employed as translators and intermediaries. They understood both worlds now, the defeated and the victor, and became bridges between two civilizations once sworn to destroy each other. Reports from occupation authorities often mention the surprising cooperation of local populations, a phenomenon partly rooted in these earlier experiences of humane treatment. Japan had seen not just America's weapons, but its will, its capacity to conquer without annihilating. In retrospect, historians would later call this a moral pivot, a moment when the ideals of modern democracy triumphed over militarist fanaticism not by force, but by example. It wasn't mercy for its own sake. It was strategy rooted in principle, a recognition that feeding a prisoner could dismantle an ideology more effectively than starving one. By 1946, as the last ships of Japanese POWs departed U.S. shores, the legacy of that decision to treat even the enemy with humanity had already begun to reshape the Pacific world. The men who had once sworn never to surrender now carried home a new image of America, not merely a victor, but a civilization of astonishing wealth and moral discipline. And through them, the seeds of post-war friendship began to grow. But every seed needs soil to take root, and Japan itself was still in ruins. Cities burned, millions homeless, hunger everywhere, and yet from that devastation, a new partnership would soon emerge. One born not from conquest, but from the lessons learned behind barbed wire. In the months after Japan's surrender, the war's silence was almost unbearable. Factories stood in ruins. Trains ran through cities reduced to skeletons of steel. The smell of smoke and salt hung over the harbors where the first American ships anchored, not as invaders, but as custodians of peace. And then something remarkable began to happen. American soldiers who had fought across the Pacific now walked the same streets they once bombed, but this time carrying food instead of rifles. They handed out powdered milk to starving children, distributed rice and medicine, and helped reopen hospitals that had no glass in their windows. For millions of Japanese citizens, it was the first time they had seen their conquerors, and the first time they realized they were not monsters. The shock was deep. For years, Japan's propaganda machine had painted Americans as brutal, soulless beasts, men who would slaughter civilians and defile the sacred. But what the people saw instead were disciplined troops, offering chocolate to children and sharing canned rations with families living in rubble. The same rations that had stunned Japanese POWs months earlier now fed their families back home. At Yokohama Harbor, a young woman watched an American ship unload sacks of wheat. She later wrote in her diary, "They came with food, not guns. I began to think this must be what victory looks like, not ours, but theirs." For the U.S. occupation forces, this policy of generosity was not accidental. General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, understood that military victory alone could not secure lasting peace. The real battle was for the Japanese spirit, to replace the old faith in militarism with a new belief in democracy, education, and human dignity. He famously told his staff, "Feed them first, then teach them." That became the doctrine of the occupation. Under MacArthur's administration, the U.S. established massive food relief programs that reached nearly every corner of Japan. Canned goods from American factories, Spam, corned beef, condensed milk became symbols of survival. Schoolchildren lined up for warm meals made from U.S. wheat. Teachers who had once lectured about imperial glory now taught basic nutrition and democracy lessons. It was more than aid. It was re-education through kindness. Former Japanese POWs returning from American camps found themselves suddenly useful. They understood English, American customs, even American humor. Many became interpreters, government aids, or cultural liaisons. Their experience of humane captivity gave them credibility among both sides. They had seen the enemy's humanity up close. One former prisoner, now working for the new Ministry of Education, wrote in a report, "Will learned America's power not from her guns, but from her bread." A full stomach can teach peace faster than any sermon. That doesn't mean what in American households. The war's emotional balance also shifted. Newspapers began publishing stories about how Japanese POWs had been treated and how many had returned home, thanking the United States for their decency. Letters arrived from Japan written in careful English. "Thank you for the food you gave us. Thank you for saving my brother's life. Thank you for showing us mercy." These small gestures softened the bitterness that still lingered among families who had lost sons in the Pacific. For many Americans, compassion became the final victory, proof that they had fought not for vengeance, but for principle. The world watched this transformation with astonishment. Nations devastated by war often breed resentment and revenge. Yet in Japan, under the occupation's guiding hand, a defeated people and their former enemy began to build something almost unthinkable: mutual respect. Factories reopened with American machinery. Farms were revived with U.S. fertilizer shipments. And through it all, a quiet gratitude grew among ordinary Japanese, not toward domination, but toward the strange, steadfast mercy of their conquerors. But beneath the surface, the trauma of surrender still lingered. Many veterans carried scars invisible to the world: shame, guilt, and the haunting question of why their empire had fallen. For them, remembering the kindness of their captors was both painful and redemptive. It was a mirror that reflected how far their nation had strayed from humanity and how far it could rise again by embracing it. As one Tokyo newspaper wrote in 1946, "Why we're defeated by strength, but redeemed by compassion." Yet the story of redemption was not over. As Japan rebuilt, its former prisoners, once fed by American hands, would soon feed a nation hungry for hope. Their memories of captivity, of dignity regained behind barbed wire, would help define the new moral fabric of post-war Japan. By 1947, Japan was a nation reborn in slow motion. Its people, once defined by sacrifice and conquest, now found meaning in survival. In cities like Osaka, Hiroshima, and Tokyo, markets reopened beneath the shells of bombed buildings. Women traded silk for rice. Men salvaged scrap metal to forge tools. Everywhere, the quiet rhythm of life returned, fragile but determined. And woven into that recovery was a single, enduring truth learned in captivity: that compassion could rebuild what war had destroyed. For the Japanese prisoners who had tasted America's rations and seen its generosity firsthand, this truth became almost sacred. Many of them returned home malnourished, but spiritually awakened. They had seen the enemy's strength, not just its factories and weapons, but its humanity. That knowledge became the seed of Japan's growth and transformation. In 1948, at a conference in Tokyo University, a former imperial officer, once held at Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, delivered a lecture to young students on the moral lessons of defeat. He spoke softly, avoiding grand gestures. "When I was captured," he said, "I believed the Americans would torture me. Instead, they fed me. I was humiliated not by their power, but by their mercy. I realized that civilization is not who wins the war, but who rebuilds the peace." That speech was later published in several newspapers. It inspired a generation of post-war intellectuals who sought to replace militarism with moral strength, discipline with compassion. The message echoed through the halls of education, government, and even business, shaping the ethics of Japan's coming industrial miracle. When Japan's new constitution was signed in 1947, its Article 9 renounced war forever. For many who had lived through captivity, that clause wasn't merely political. It was personal. It was the written form of what they had learned behind the fences of POW camps. That true color lies not in conquest, but in the restraint to never repeat it. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, American policymakers watched in cautious admiration as Japan rose from its ruins with astonishing speed. Factories rebuilt with U.S. materials began exporting textiles, machinery, and electronics within a decade. Yet beneath the economic boom, a quieter evolution continued. Cultural respect. In American classrooms, new textbooks portrayed the Japanese people not as fanatics, but as partners in democracy. Films and documentaries showed images of U.S. soldiers playing with Japanese children, symbolizing a new era of trust. Historians would later trace this soft reconciliation not to diplomacy or treaties, but to the emotional groundwork laid in POW camps years earlier. Mercy had achieved what bombs could not. It had redefined an enemy's heart. By the 1950s, many former Japanese POWs returned to America, not as captives, but as visitors, businessmen, and scholars. They walked freely through the same cities whose guards had once watched over them. Some even sought out their former captors to thank them. One remarkable meeting took place in 1953 when a Japanese engineer visited a retired U.S. Army officer in Illinois. The two men had first met 8 years earlier, one as a guard, the other as a prisoner. They shared lunch together, laughing over old misunderstandings. Before leaving, the Japanese man handed the officer a small gift, a folded piece of silk with the words, embroidered in English, "You showed me life when I expected death." That quiet reunion symbolized something vast, the transformation of hatred into gratitude, of defeat into friendship. In Japan, the influence of those moral lessons continued to ripple through society. The economic miracle that followed was not only fueled by industry and trade, but also by an ethic of cooperation and humility, traits that had replaced the old martial code. Factories emphasized collective effort, discipline, and care for workers. Schools taught respect for human life as the foundation of peace. Even popular culture reflected it. Films by directors like Kurosawa explored the struggle between pride and compassion, echoing the moral reckoning of a nation reborn. And through it all, American aid and guidance continued, not as occupation, but as alliance. The two nations that had once fought the most brutal war in the Pacific now stood side by side as partners in the Cold War, defending a shared vision of democracy and progress. But for those who had lived it, the soldiers, the prisoners, the civilians, the memory of mercy remained the most haunting weapon of all. It had overturned everything they had been taught. It had shown them that kindness, wielded by a powerful nation, could humble even the proudest empire. In the end, the Japanese prisoners of war were not just witnesses to defeat, they were witnesses to transformation. Their astonishment at American kindness, their disbelief at endless food rations, became part of Japan's moral DNA. It was a revelation passed quietly from one generation to the next. That victory built on cruelty fades, but victory built on compassion endures. And as Japan's skyline rose again, neon lights where once there had been ashes, many who had lived through those days would look back on their captivity not as humiliation, but as the beginning of wisdom. History often remembers wars by their weapons, the tanks, the bombs, the numbers. But the Second World War, for all its machinery, revealed something deeper, that the measure of civilization is not how it destroys its enemies, but how it treats them once they fall. For the Japanese prisoners who stood behind American barbed wire, the true shock of defeat was not the loss of empire, it was the discovery of mercy. They had been raised to believe that surrender erased one's humanity. Instead, they found that their humanity was returned to them, not through victory, but through kindness. In every loaf of bread, every shared ration, every gesture of decency, America displayed the quiet confidence of a nation that did not need cruelty to prove its strength. That was its greatest weapon, the moral supremacy of abundance and fairness. The prisoners saw it in the kitchens of their camps, in the discipline of their guards, in the vast, unending flow of food and supplies that no empire could match. It was a vision of power that fed rather than destroyed. When those men went home, they carried more than memories. They carried a mirror. In that mirror, Japan saw not only its defeat, but its possibility. The same people who once worshipped sacrifice began to honor life. The same soldiers who once pledged to die for the emperor began to teach their children the value of peace. And from that awakening rose a new Japan, democratic, industrious, and in many ways built upon the very mercy that once humbled it. In time, the two nations that had burned each other's cities would stand together as allies, proving that even from the ashes of total war, mutual respect could emerge stronger than hatred. It was not a miracle. It was the logical consequence of compassion, the final, quiet victory of civilization over vengeance. Because sometimes the greatest triumph in war is not the defeat of an enemy, but the redemption of their humanity.